Hi everyone, Alvin here from Relab Academy. Today I'm going to talk to you about minimum viable product. What is it? I'm going to talk about the definition here in a very simple way. The benefits of a minimum viable product, or people call this MVP. So if you hear the word MVP in the tech world, or if you're working in digital, then this is what it means exactly. And also some of the examples of MVP and how it has, made some companies really huge and successful. So let's talk about it. So what is an MVP? An MVP is a product with a minimum set of features to attract early users and validate the ideas of the product in the initial phase within the product development cycle. So a lot of the times an MVP is being used to just test an idea because a startup might have a set of different features that they wanted to go in and say, this is our product, this is what we want to do. And MVP just allows them to focus on potentially that killer feature that they think is the main point of differentiation of their product, and go out to test in the market and have real users actually download the app or sign up and actually use the feature to give them feedback. And this oftentimes gives products or startups or teams a good understanding on an appetite and what the market wants or needs, or whether or not it resonates to what the market wants. So that's what an MVP is essentially. So let's look at the reasons on why does one company want to build an MVP, or why should you build an MVP? Number one is to release the product in the market sooner. Rather than finishing up all 10 features or the grand vision, you focus on one or two key features, and it allows you to go to the market sooner rather than later. Number two is also to test the concept with users before further investment. So startups might have rounds of investments, and if like to achieve all of those 10 features that I mentioned earlier will take them 3 years to do. By having an MVP, they get to focus on the most important thing and be able to go out and prove that their idea has merit in the market, and that allows them to go to investors and have them further invest in the next rounds or the next seed rounds potentially. The third thing is to learn what's resonating with the market and what's not. So what's very important is for you to understand if your idea is not working, then you might really want to know as soon as possible rather than later. A lot of startups out there fail because they're trying to invest so much time to perfect their product, but once it goes out, no one downloads it and no one wants to use it because the market hasn't really seen it, and it comes in as a surprise. And in the course of a year or two, they've invested so much money, time, effort, and resources and all of that, and that's why a lot of companies or startups go bankrupt, because they've spent way too much time the development cycle without involving the user. So it's important to know what's resonating and what's not. And finally, the other reason is to minimize the resources and time that would otherwise be spent on developing a product that won't sell. So companies would go out and build products. Now, this happens to a lot of big companies as well, that they would go out and test it in the market, but it won't sell. And for some companies, they have the luxury of losing money like that, and that's fine. But for smaller startups out there, this is so risky. And this is what investors don't really want as well, is for them to put in money and then they just lose them, right? So by having an MVP, you get to minimize the risk of all of this, because otherwise, you would spend way more money rather than not. Now, I also get a lot of questions, and I feel like it's great to answer this here. I get questions around what's the difference between an MVP and a prototype? Aren't they, the same thing? Aren't they like a product in progress? Well, not really. I think there are three main differences here, and I'll clarify them in a way that I hope makes sense. Number one is the scope. So the scope is different because a prototype requires less time and effort. An MVP requires more resources, effort, and manpower. And the reason is really because of the commitment here. Once you commence an MVP, it's very less likely that you're going to drop it completely, because an MVP is really a real product, but just with less features in it. Rather than 10, you're doing 1 or 2, as I said earlier. A prototype is simpler to dump the idea and then just restart again, because a prototype oftentimes is not a real product. Sometimes it's not even working. When I say it's not working, it's not like a real product that is built. It could just be a series of designs or a series of wireframes, or it could just be a demo that an engineer might have done, but it's not ready to go out to the market yet. So a prototype is oftentimes done before you achieve an MVP. It's actually a step way before you go out and produce an MVP. And the other main difference is around the audience here. So prototype tends to stay internally with a handful of users for feedback, whether it's stakeholders, or whether it's just within the internal teams and you only invite a number of real users to go and test it and give you feedback, but it's not out in the market yet. You haven't gone out and say, we've got this new app, go and download it. It stays internally because you're just prototyping and you're just testing it within your internal teams. An MVP are built and they're ready to be sold to a wider group of end users or early adopters. So oftentimes, you will hear products are launched as a beta version, and oftentimes it can be an MVP because they haven't completed the whole thing, but it's out there. It's ready for early adopters to go and test it and download it. And sometimes an MVP is not being sold yet. If there's like monetization behind all of that product, an MVP might not be sold yet. It's ready for a free trial essentially. So the difference is one stays internally and the other one, an MVP, goes out to the market. Now, I want to talk about the advantages of an MVP as well. So it's an opportunity to acquire early adopters and advocates. One of the strongest things to have as a startup or a new product is for you to start gaining loyal followers and loyal fans to your product or the idea that you have, whatever it is. So an MVP is great for you to go out to those early adopters and say, hey, I've got this new product, this new idea, it does A, B, and C. Why don't you go and try and test it and let us know what you think. And if they love it, they can become advocates of that product or that idea. An MVP helps reduce development cost as well, while maximizing the learnings, which is what companies need as they develop their product or they're improving their product development cycle. So they get to learn more by releasing their products sooner rather than later. And it's faster time to market as well. It's faster anticipation of the market demand and faster adjustments based on rapid feedback. When you launch an MVP, sooner rather than later, you get feedback way earlier as well, rather than later. So that's always great for companies to be able to reflect back, kill some of the features that they might want to build in the pipeline because the user said so, they don't really want it or they don't need it. This 2 features is all they need, and they get to shift their focus in their development cycle as well. So there's a lot of learnings that they can do because of that rapid feedback from the user. Now let's talk about the things that are not so good with MVPs as well, just so you get a point of view here. When you launch an MVP earlier than your competitors, competitors can potentially analyze and even copy your ideas potentially. Now I would argue it's not so much of a bad thing. If you're out earlier, you get to learn earlier, then you get to adapt, pivot, change, learn earlier than your competitors as well. So it's not so much of a bad thing, but one thing to note, yes, competitors might be able to see that you've done this and they might try and do something that's slightly better than what you're doing. Users may lose trust if they don't like your MVP. So once you launch your initial product, your MVP, users get to test it. Those early adopters that you hope was going to be an advocate or a fan of your product, they don't like it or they hate it so much they go, no, I'm not going to trust this brand anymore. So as a brand, that might affect you and you might need to change your whole strategy again. So that's a negative that you can think of as well when launching an MVP. So you don't want to lose trust way too early. Negative impressions because of that problem can build up if you're not able to address user feedback promptly. So when you launch an MVP, users might come to you and say, look, I love your product, but I wish there was this and that and that. If you don't address that promptly, users will also lose trust and they think that you're only doing this for the fun of it and you're not taking it seriously and stuff like that. So you need to up your customer service level game as well when you start launching your product. So you got to think about all of that systems and back end too. So I'm going to go through some examples of big brands out there that started with an MVP and give you some examples here. So Foursquare, if you know what they are now, they're much bigger than what they were back then. They started as a gamified location check-in app, and that's all it is, and mainly in the US and places like New York and stuff like that. But now they've grown into a full-blown city guide, which is much bigger than what they were. But all they were back then is just a check-in app, a check-in location app, and that's what it was. And not too different from what Amazon was as well. So Amazon, they were just an online bookstore, and that's what their focus was. They just wanted to sell books online. But you know what Amazon is today? They're like the biggest giant of e-commerce site, offering really like almost everything. But they have the same focus, which is personalized shopping experience. But they've got, the systems, infrastructure, AWS. There's all sorts of other products and businesses that are built around Amazon. But what they started off as their MVP was an online bookstore, and that's what it was. Airbnb is another one. So all they were really is a side hustle about room sharing. A couple of friends started this as sharing as a room sharing application or website. Now they've evolved into the biggest travel accommodation provider in the world, really because of, they kept improving from there. Obviously they've had a lot of challenges over the years, as we know, but all they started off really was a side hustle of renting their rooms or just sharing their rooms with travelers. That was it, and that was their MVP. So if we learn from this, I guess the main focus is for you to be able to pick what you think is the unique selling proposition of your product or idea and focus on that. Don't overcomplicate it too much. As you're developing your product or as you're designing your product, you will always have ideas, especially when you involve investors, stakeholders, everyone will have their own piece of an idea. But what's important is to prioritize, work together collaboratively, use some of the design thinking methods that I've also shared in this channel. But from there, once you prioritize, you know where to start and focus on that, release that, do it in a low-risk way, and from there you get to learn something and be able to decide on whether you go, this way or the other. All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what a minimum viable product is, or an MVP, and hopefully that's helpful for you in your product journey or in your career or in your studies. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video, guys.